Chapter 23, The Secret Keeper's Tale, mid-October. I can't do this, Ron said hoarsely. I'm done. He turned on his heel, the suffocating darkness closing in around him. Ron Weasley was racing away from the Potter cottage, away from his best friend and the girl he had envisioned as his future, away from the sickening feeling of rejection that clung to him like a shadow. Home, he thought, clinging desperately to the idea of reaching it. At that moment, he didn't care about anything else, not Grindelwald, nor some powerful wand, nor the locket in Umbridge's possession. All he could think about was escaping the mortification etched on Hermione's face, the stunned discomfort reflected in Harry's eyes, and the cold anger radiating from Malfoy. He couldn't endure another moment in that place. With a sudden burst, Ron emerged from the darkness into a small grove of trees near Ottery Street, Catchpole. This was the usual spot where local wizards would apparate. It was far enough from town that muggles wouldn't hear anything, and the woods were laced with muggle-repelling charms to deter anyone out for a stroll. So, it was a shock when Ron didn't materialize in the dark, quiet solitude of the woods, but instead found himself in the flickering light of a campfire. He was not met with silence but with a triumphant shout, impedimenta. Ron had no time to reach for his wand. He was blasted off his feet. His back slamming into a tree, his head colliding with a branch so hard that stars exploded behind his closed eyelids. What we got here, Scabier? Came a wheezy, gleeful voice. As Ron's vision began to clear, he saw half a dozen grubby men and women circling toward him in the reddish glow of the fire. He tried to wiggle his hand into his pocket, but ropes had already snaked around him, binding him so tightly to the tree that he couldn't move a muscle. Looks like he could be Hogwarts age, said the man called Scabier, sidling closer. Get the truant's list, Smith. As a woman rummaged through a knapsack at the campsite, Ron's heart sank. Ron spotted a huddled line of figures on the far side of the fire, chains glinting around their hands and feet. The thought that this might be a trap set for Harry quickly faded from his mind. Bounty hunters, he realized. They were likely searching for Muggleborns and Order sympathizers on the run. What's your name, Ginger? Scabier asked, stepping closer. His breath was foul, as if he hadn't brushed his teeth in weeks. St. Stan. Shunpike, Ron gasped, still reeling from the impact. Like hell it is, Scabier replied, his tone dripping with disdain. We know Stan Shunpike. He's done a bit of work for us. Before Ron could react, Scabier's ringed fist slammed into his jaw, causing his vision to white out. His captors chuckled as he sagged against the ropes binding him. Ron's mind raced, cycling through the most profane curses he knew. Why hadn't he anticipated something like this? How could he have left headquarters without his wand in hand? Headquarters. His stomach dropped like a stone. If they sent him back to Hogwarts as a truant, Snape would extract the secret of the Potter cottage straight from his mind. In that moment, Ron's wounded feelings toward his friends were eclipsed by sheer panic. He couldn't let Snape get to them. I'm not on that list, he panted, desperation creeping into his voice. Finished Hogwarts ages ago. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, sizing him up. He's tall enough, one of them grunted, could be a fair bit older. Mudblood on the run, then? No, I'm just going home, that's all. I live in Ottery Street, Catchpole. Just took a business trip. Oh, really? Sneered the one holding the list. What's your name and address, then? We've got every wizard on the local registry right here. Ron gaped at the stack of papers in her hands. The bounty hunters' faces twisted into leering satisfaction. Mudblood, this one, the woman with the papers declared, and Ron felt a chill run down his spine. Murmurs of agreement echoed around him. An icy rush swept through Ron as he realized that this alternative was even worse than Hogwarts. If they thought he was on the run from the law, they would take him straight to the ministry. Someone there would recognize Arthur Weasley's son, one of the 6 who had broken into the Department of Mysteries. They would know he had been on the run with Harry. Instead of being handed over to Snape, he would end up in the clutches of Bellatrix Lestrange. For the first time, Ron truly felt the weight of being the secret keeper. He recalled the pride he had felt that night when he agreed to take on the responsibility, the way Hermione and Harry had looked at him with such confidence, making him feel as if he glowed like a heated chunk of gold. Now, as he struggled desperately against his restraints, he envisioned them back at headquarters. Were they waiting for him to return? Would they go to sleep expecting him back by morning? Only to wake in the middle of the night to find Bellatrix's face, twisted with mad delight in the darkness, having torn the secret out of his mind. I still haven't heard a name, Ginger, Scabier said softly, stepping closer. Ron's mind was a chaotic roar. He needed time. He needed a plan, but he had neither. Go to hell, he gasped, wrenching hard at the ropes. Scabier responded with a punch, his knuckle striking Ron squarely on the nose. A nasty crack echoed in the air, and pain shot through Ron's head like a breath of icy wind. In that moment, he did the only thing he could think of to buy himself more time. He slumped forward and pretended to lose consciousness. He heard Scabier spit at his feet. Pathetic, the bounty hunter sneered. Search him and put him with the others, you three, we'll question him properly in the morning. Hands began to grope through his pockets, worming their way between the ropes. One of them yanked his wand free, but as they reached for his trousers, something curious happened. One of the hunters was feeling around in the front pocket where Ron always. Ron clutched the deluminator tightly, aware he had it in his possession before disapparating from headquarters, yet, the bounty hunter remained silent, seemingly indifferent. As the hunters cut the ropes binding him, Ron let his body go limp, dropping to the ground like a rag doll. Someone caught him halfway, only to kick him roughly back down, eliciting laughter from the others. His ribs throbbed with pain as he considered making a grab for one of their wands and fighting back, but there were too many. 3 were assigned to him, with 3 more ready to jump in at a moment's notice. After being searched, the hunters dragged him across the campsite and threw him against a log. He stifled a groan as his spine collided with a hard knot in the wood. Just then, he felt magical chains wrapping around him, and the sound of retreating footsteps filled the air. It took a long time before Ron dared to peek through his cracked eyelids. His heart raced as he recognized the faces staring back at him, Ted Tonks and Dean Thomas. Ted's fair hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and his belly hung loosely, as if he hadn't eaten in days. Dean appeared gaunt, his dark skin glowing in the firelight. Ron opened his mouth to speak, but Ted quickly hushed him, glancing down at the ground. Not now, son, he said softly. So, Ron let his eyes flutter shut once more, the pain in his face throbbing spectacularly, radiating from his jaw to his nose and back again. After what felt like an eternity, he heard the last rustles of the Snatchers as they settled into their tents. Only then did they dare to talk. Ted, Ron whispered, trying to sit up. Dean. His gaze drifted over the other captives, 2 young women huddled together at the end of the log. Likely sisters, and a man beside Dean who looked somewhat familiar. I'm Dirk Cresswell, the man whispered. You're Arthur's son, aren't you? Yeah, that's right, Ron replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He recalled meeting Dirk at the ministry once, one of those fleeting encounters that now felt so distant. Of the understaffed goblin liaison office, wore dark circles under his eyes from countless nights spent preparing goblin defense cases for court. He looked even more exhausted now, his curly dark hair tousled and his robes tattered. What's happening? Dean whispered, concern etched on his face. I thought you were sick at your parents' place. Ron hesitated, licking the blood from his lips. I can't say much. It's safer that way. Right, but what about Harry? Hermione? A pang of shame shot through Ron. They're all right, he mumbled. Look, I need to get out of here. Can you help me with my chains? Or, Ted Tonks shook his head. If there were any way out, don't you think we would have done it by now? His tone was firm but not unkind. Ron tried to reach into his front pocket, feeling the deluminator nestled there, but the chains were unyielding. Eventually, he gave up. What was the point anyway? In the months since he had found the small silver tool, it had only served one purpose, turning out the lights. Typical, he thought bitterly. Dumbledore had left Gryffindor's sword to Harry. And to Hermione, a secret message about Grindelwald. and what had Ron received? A parlor trick. Listen, he whispered urgently. I can't be turned into Snape or the Death Eaters. It's important. He glanced at the others, hoping they would grasp that it was about the order without needing too much explanation. There's no other option, Dean said hopelessly. I don't have a proper wizarding family tree, so they'll send me to the ministry for trial. Ted nodded in agreement. It's the same for me, he murmured, giving Dean's leg a reassuring nudge. We'll probably get a year or less in Azkaban for carrying wands, and after that, they'll expect us to live as muggles. I'll warn you too. Dirk Cresswell's serious expression deepened. The dim glow of the smoldering embers cast shadows on Ron's sunken features. It's not much of a trial, Cresswell remarked. You've already been tried? Ron asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cresswell nodded. Had my family tree forged. I managed to escape on the way to Azkaban. They'll bring me right back, I suppose. A hard lump rose in Ron's throat as the weight of the situation settled in. Suddenly, a strategy unfolded in his mind, as instinctive as breathing, of course, he thought numbly. He recalled being 12 years old, staring up at the blank face of the White Queen in a game of chess. Once again, he was destined to be the sacrificial piece. They'll bring you back to Azkaban, he said quietly, no questions asked. The other three exchanged glances of somber understanding. Cresswell nodded. No questions asked. Did you escape with anyone, Dirk? Ron pressed, trying to sound braver than he felt. Other convicts, I mean. 2 others, Cresswell replied, licking his cracked lips. An older witch from the Obliviation Squads, and a younger bloke, Samuel Giddyborough, 23 or 24. Assistant to someone in accidents and catastrophes, you might be able to pass for him. Does he look like Ron? Dean whispered. Ted twitched his nose, adjusting his small spectacles. That won't matter, Dean. The Snatchers lists don't include descriptions. There's no room for that when they're hunting thousands of Muggleborns. Just name, age, and blood status. And the Dementors won't care who they're taking in, Cresswell added, his mouth twisted with contempt. They'll be pleased to have a warm new body. A chill ran down Ron's spine. As they listened to the faint hiss of the dying embers, Cresswell's gaze turned to Ron. Our sentences were all 5 years, Weasley. Are you sure you know what you're? Yeah, Ron interrupted, his voice clipped. I've got no choice. But as he turned over in an attempt to sleep, fear wrapped around him like cold, clammy fingers. Ron stood at the edge of the rocky island, his heart racing as he gazed up at the imposing structure of Azkaban. The prison loomed like a dark monolith against the flat, gray sky, devoid of life, no seabirds, no signs of movement. An oppressive atmosphere hung over the place, reminiscent of a deathbed. Even from the apparition point at the farthest tip of the island, Ron could feel a chilling aura radiating from the fortress, creeping through him like ice. Beside him, Dirk Cresswell shuddered, and Ron couldn't help but picture the Snatchers as they pushed them along the path, hooded Dementors gliding over the prison's surface, dwarfed by the stark rock face. Remember how Sirius kept his head in here, Ron urged himself. You haven't done anything wrong. But his gaze was drawn to the door ahead, the black notch in the seemingly impenetrable wall. A wave of terror washed over him, and for a brief moment, he considered making a break for it, weighing the perilous drop into the churning ocean against the Snatchers at his back. He kept walking. Bang! The cell door slammed shut behind him, and Ron staggered forward, the tendrils of cold gripping his lungs so tightly that he gasped for air like an asthmatic. He scrambled away from the hooded face of a Dementor looming just beyond the bars. A distant part of him recalled a reassuring thought he'd clung to outside, but the memory was lost in the overwhelming presence of the Dementors. They swarmed the halls like a dark tide. Remember, he told himself, remember. But no comforting recollection came. All that remained was the numbing horror of being trapped in this tiny cell, wandless, hopeless, and clad in ragged prison clothes. They had stripped him of his robes, tossing them aside with the scant few human guards, leaving him without even the small solace of his useless deluminator. Now, He had nothing but a threadbare blanket on a grimy mattress beneath a window that was little more than a 2-inch slit in the wall, the hero, while he remained the afterthought. The walls of his cell felt like they were closing in, allowing barely a sliver of light to penetrate, yet, Ron clambered onto the cot and pressed his eye against the narrow slit. He gazed out at the vast, endless ocean. Struggling to catch his breath, he lost track of time, staring out into the horizon for hours until the sun dipped below the water and night fell. This night felt more dreadful than any he had ever experienced. Ron sank back onto the cot, gasping as the chilling presence of the Dementor seeped into his very bones. The darkness weighed heavily on him, amplifying the doubts that had plagued him throughout the day. Of course you'd end up here, Ron. Haven't you always been useless? This is where you belong, rotting away. Harry would never have let himself be caught like this. Hermione would have been ready with her wand. Staring at the ceiling, his jaw slack, Ron wrestled with the thought, how had he ever truly helped his friends? He had been trapped during the cave-in in the Chamber of Secrets, unconscious while Harry and Hermione saved Sirius. He had been attacked by the brains in the Department of Mysteries, reduced to vomiting slugs when he tried to stand up for Hermione in second year. The memories flooded back to him, vivid and painful. He was nothing compared to them. Sure, he had won a few Quidditch matches, so what? Everyone knew Harry was the real star of the team. Even Fred and George had outshone him before they left, and now Ginny was beginning to eclipse him, despite being younger. At the thought of his family, Ron curled into a ball. When had his mom or dad ever truly seen him as special or capable? Perhaps when he received the prefect's badge. That had been one bright moment. He tried to hold on to the memory of that night, the party in his honor, but even that felt tainted. Hadn't Hermione assumed it would be Harry who got the badge? She had looked stunned when she realized it was him. Over the past year, while Ron had embarrassed himself with Lavender, it seemed Hermione had come to prefer Harry. If he ever managed to escape this place, he would likely find them together, the prodigy and the hero, while he remained an afterthought. The chosen one, they would scoff at the notion that he ever truly belonged alongside them. Ron tried to hold on to memories of the time spent with Harry and Hermione, those cozy evenings in Gryffindor Tower, yet, even the happiest moments were marred by the realization that he often felt like the least significant of the three friends. The least remarkable among his 7 siblings, never quite impressive or desirable. His own desires, his feelings for Hermione, his longing for recognition and approval, felt painfully childish and humiliating. A chilling wave swept through the cell as a pair of Dementors glided by outside. Ron turned over, freezing, shivering, gasping for breath. In that moment, he felt something strange, a lump in the pocket of his prison clothes. Confusion broke through the thick fog of despair. He slipped his hand into the front pocket and, somehow, impossibly, his fingers brushed against the warm metal of the deluminator. A flicker of hope surged in his throat. He pulled it out, bewildered by how it had found its way back to him. Surely, there must be help within. He pressed the silver catch. Nothing happened. No, Ron moaned, wiping cold sweat from his brow. No, no. He clicked it repeatedly, but there was no light to collect in the dark cell. The deluminator held no promise for him. Defeated, he collapsed back onto the cot, shoving the useless device through a tear in the mattress, burying it deep within the filthy insulation. Let it remain there forever, a reminder of his own insignificance. With no strength left to fight, Ron succumbed to sleep. Every day in Azkaban was the same. He woke from nightmares to eat the stale bread and water left at his door, chewing and swallowing mechanically. For 1 hour each day. Lower security prisoners were allowed to stroll around the yard, a bleak expanse of gravel enclosed by Azkaban's grim walls. During his hour, Ron spent time with others from his prison sector, including Dirk Cresswell, who looked more gaunt than ever. In those first few days, Ron vaguely recognized a few other faces around the yard. Someone who might have been. Ron Weasley found himself working as a shop assistant at Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, a place where he might have caught a glimpse of a parent at platform 9 3/4. But soon, he stopped caring about faces, names, or identities altogether. All that remained was a sense of mindless habit. He walked alongside Dirk Cresswell. But most of the other prisoners were so weak and hopeless that they simply huddled against the walls. Each hour felt indistinguishable from the last. In his cell, Ron dreaded the rattling approach of the Dementors on their rounds, who would occasionally linger outside his door. Whenever they were near, his emotions became as raw as open wounds. He saw himself in a harsh light, like an unflattering candid photograph. Ron Weasley, a boy with no real accomplishments other than being in the shadow of Harry Potter. As night fell, he would receive a second meal, followed by hours of suffocating darkness. The overwhelming sense of loneliness felt as if he were slowly being peeled away from himself. Bit by bit, time passed, but Ron couldn't tell how many days had slipped by, perhaps even weeks. He could hardly make out Dirk Cresswell's face when they met in the yard for their walks. One day, he recognized Dean Thomas and Ted Tonks among the convicts, their presence confirming the grim reality they all shared. The four of them trudged in a circle, but Ron found no motivation to speak. All sense of curiosity had drained from him. The world felt flat, devoid of color and life. Eventually, he couldn't walk any longer. He sank against one of the walls, joining the many others, and it seemed to him that fading into obscurity might just be the most sensible choice. Then, one night, Ron's eyes fluttered open. As he struggled to drift off to sleep, he could have sworn he heard a voice. It wasn't a moan or a cry echoing down the hall, but rather a tiny, muffled voice emanating from within his cell. So, he was losing his mind, though that didn't come as much of a surprise. It was becoming increasingly difficult to force down even the smallest amount of food. Of course, his mind would be the next to go. When he lifted his heavy head, he heard nothing, but when he lay back down, pressing his ear against the mattress, and there it was, a faint whisper, "Ron." The sound seemed to emanate from within the mattress itself. Curiosity piqued. Ron slipped his hand into a tear in the fabric, feeling around until his fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. With trembling hands, he retrieved the deluminator. Harry's voice echoed from within, filled with determination, "Ron." Moments later, Hermione's voice joined in, laced with concern, "Ron." Confused, Ron pressed the deluminator's silver catch and peered into its chamber. There, he saw two wisps of light, suspended like delicate strands of unicorn hair, ethereal and seemingly weightless, one for each of their calls. He clicked the catch again and again, but the wisps remained too weak to escape into the air as they once had. They merely stirred within the confines of the deluminator. "Harry, Hermione. Can you hear me?" he croaked, but silence enveloped him, broken only by the faint echo of their names. A rustle came from beyond his door. Ron snapped the deluminator shut, but once the Dementor had passed, he pressed the button again, gazing into the dim glow. For weeks, muffled in the mattress, he might have missed whispers like these. The wisps barely cast enough light to outline his finger in the darkness. The fog of despair was too thick for clear thought, yet the voices soothed his mind in a primal way. "They're alive," he thought, "somewhere, they're alive." Soon after, or perhaps it was much longer, time had lost its meaning. Other voices began to join the chorus. One by one, Ron started keeping the deluminator in his pocket, allowing him to hear them as they arrived. "Ron." His mother's voice came, choked with emotion. "Ron." His father's voice followed, thin and weary. Then came Ginny, Neville, Luna, the twins, Charlie, Bill, and even Fleur Delacour. The whispers gathered in the deluminator, and Ron looked down into the soft glow of its chamber, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. Nightfall settled around Ron. The light couldn't solve his problems, but he found that he could still make himself walk in the yard again. One afternoon, as he trudged along beside his companions, his hand wrapped around the deluminator in his pocket provided him with a small measure of comfort. Perhaps it was childish, but he had decided he wasn't above a little childishness. Through the familiar dark fog, he recalled hearing Seamus Finnegan's voice the night before, calling out his name in a bracing sort of way. "Did you see Seamus over the summer?" he rasped, breaking the heavy silence that hung in the air. The disruption was so unexpected that all three of his walking companions halted, turning to him with blank, hopeless expressions. Dean, Ted, and Dirk looked almost unrecognizable, their faces drawn and weary. Seamus, Dean repeated softly, yeah. I went to his place for a week in August. Had you been before? Ron asked, eager for the conversation to continue. Dean paused, as if he were slowly flipping through a book of memories. Yeah. Before the Quidditch World Cup. I went with him and his mum. The cup. Ron's mind flooded with images, tents adorned with shamrocks, Bulgarian Quidditch robes soaring through a cheering stadium. We didn't see you there. Seamus mentioned seeing you, Dean said, his voice barely above a whisper. You, Harry, and Hermione. Yeah, Ron managed to reply. After that, the four of them fell into silence for the rest of the walk. Later that night, after sunset, Ron huddled beneath his threadbare blanket and clicked the deluminator. Peering into the chamber, he felt a momentary easing of his tense muscles. The light seemed to dull the sharp edges of his painful feelings. He wondered, vaguely, if the light felt stronger than it had the night before. Holding the deluminator away from his eye, he confirmed it. There was no mistake. The light within was bright enough to illuminate the freckles on his skin beneath the blanket, and suddenly, he found himself confronting the reality of his own body, his own existence, when he looked down at his bony hands and arms, suddenly aware of just how hungry he was, ravenous. In fact, Ron's mind felt sluggish and dull, but for the first time in weeks, actual thoughts began to form, thoughts that broke through the crushing weight of his own worthlessness. Why is the light stronger? He remembered speaking to Dean in the yard while holding the deluminator. Leaning forward, he whispered into it. The Quidditch World Cup. He squeezed his eyes shut, brow furrowed, desperately searching for something to offer the light. The Quidditch World Cup. Il liked going. He felt the oppressive presence of Azkaban all around him, clawing at the memory, reminding him of how he'd embarrassed himself over the villa there. It brought back the grim reminder that, at the end of that night, the Death Eaters had attacked, heralding their reign of terror, which had led to this nightmare. But he didn't take his eyes off the light of the deluminator. We were in the top box, he croaked. Dad was proud he could take us. Harry loved it. We got him away from the Dursleys. Hermione even liked reading about Quidditch for once. Best seats in the stadium, and they said Ireland was the best team in decades. The words left him trembling, almost nauseated. They drained him of so much energy. Yet, as he spoke, he could see the light pulsing beneath him, wisps coalescing into a brilliant bead the size of a fingernail. He focused on it for as long as he could, but his strength was fading fast, and he eventually succumbed to unconsciousness. The days that followed were agonizing in new ways. The biting cold air, his relentless hunger and sadness, the bleakness of the prison, and the pain etched on every face in the yard, all of it felt sharper than before. Yet Ron realized this intensity was a sign that he was becoming lucid again. Each night, he whispered a happy memory into the deluminator. But the Dementor's influence was so strong that the memories began to twist, threatening to transform into dark pockets of fear or despair. Anxiety gnawed at Ron, but he gritted his teeth and focused on the light, willing it to pierce through the shadows of his mind until it created spots in his vision. He made a conscious effort to speak only of the good. With each memory, he could begin to measure time again. The first night, he recalled the World Cup. The second night, his triumphant victory in Quidditch during his 5th year. And so it continued. After a week of depositing memories into the deluminator, he found himself huddled under a blanket one night. Pressing the catch. Light burst forth, hanging in the air like a shapeless orb, roughly the size of a walnut. A gasp escaped his lips as warmth enveloped him like a comforting embrace, the first relief he had felt since entering Azkaban. Suddenly, thoughts surged within him, frantic and overlapping, building upon one another. He clutched the deluminator and whispered, I'm doing the best I can. I'm keeping them safe. As he spoke, the hovering light expanded, growing just a millimeter larger. He leaned closer and could hear Harry's and Hermione's voices echoing in his mind. Ron. I'm keeping them safe, he gasped again. All this time I've been here, I've kept them safe. The light pulsed and swelled around him. He pressed the deluminator against his lips, feeling its warmth fog with his breath. He realized how tightly he was gripping it, aware of his racing heart and the jagged edges of his nerves. I'm here for a reason, he said firmly. The next day, Ron's trip to the yard felt different. For the first time, he took note of how the Dementors shuffled their way through the prison. He observed their movements day after day, until he could mentally map the corridors and retrace them in his mind. In the yard, he walked alongside his three companions, wishing he could release the light to empower them too, but he knew the Dementor standing along the perimeter would sense any disturbance. Instead, he whispered, "Don't stop walking, don't look at me, but I got something into the prison." Their steps hesitated, but Dean, Ted and Dirk pressed on. "How, son?" Ted whispered, a note of concern in his voice. "If they catch you." "They won't. Here. Take it." Ron slipped the deluminator into Ted's hand, and he heard Ted draw a small gasp. Instantly, Ron felt a chill. The warmth he had just experienced began to fade, and his spirits dipped. "Hold your hands up to your mouth like you're breathing into them," he instructed quietly, "and say something happy. Whisper a happy memory into it." Ted's gentle face turned ashen. Ron could hear him straining as he whispered, "Nymphadora. My Dora. The day she was born. Andromeda was in labor for 6 hours when we held Dora. We both cried, we were so happy. Andromeda never cries." For the next hour, they walked, passing the deluminator back and forth, whispering memories under the pretense of warming their hands. As they moved, Ron mentally mapped the courtyard, noting that it was shaped like a pentagon. He counted the 5 exits and observed the sheer, windowless walls surrounding them. That night, fueled by the strength of their memories, the deluminator's light brightened even more. Ron dared not let the light shine for too long, mindful of the Dementor's relentless patrols, but day after day, the 4 of them walked and shared, night after night. Happy memories flowed more freely from Ron. Now, he could whisper hours' worth into the deluminator. When he recounted Quidditch matches, it became easier to focus on the joy of those moments rather than Harry's extraordinary talent, Ginny's star quality, or the twins' zany antics. In those moments, he realized he was the one that mattered most to the deluminator. One night, he recalled a memory from their 3rd year. Snape had called Hermione an insufferable know-it-all, and Ron had snapped back, "You asked a question, and she knows the answer. Why ask if you don't want to be told?" Of course, he'd received attention for it. But the real joy lay in that moment of defensive pride for Hermione, the impressed hush that had settled over the class. In that moment, Ron felt a surge of defiant clarity wash over him. Without even realizing it, he found himself whispering to the deluminator, "I stand up for my friends." The device burned hot in his hand, and, startled, he clicked it. The light that burst forth, now the size of a tangerine, pulsed with fierce intensity. Ron instinctively recoiled against the damp wall, feeling the glow push back against the oppressive darkness that had seeped deep into his very being. "I stand up for my friends," he thought again. Yes, he had argued with Hermione and envied Harry for his fame. But he had also vowed to stand by their side until the end, fully aware that death could await them on that path. He would fight to protect them, always. It was not something to boast about, like the time he bragged about his Quidditch saves by the lake. No, it was simply a truth about himself that Ron realized he felt proud of. Gazing into the light, he swallowed hard and whispered, "Yeah, that's what I do. I stand up for my friends, and my family, too." The light pulsed again, and Ron noticed that he could no longer look directly into its center. It had grown so bright that it was almost blinding. Suddenly, a noise echoed down the hall. Startled, Ron clicked the deluminator off again and stumbled back to the cot. Cold dread washing over him. Had the Dementor sensed the light? Worse still, had they uncovered his true identity? He sensed a wave of Dementors approaching, a chilling tide. No, it was a new prisoner. A small voice was pleading, moaning, "No, let me out. Please, let me out." When he heard the clang of the cell door beside him, the echoes didn't fade away. Instead, the voice seemed to pierce through the wall, growing weaker but still desperate. "Please." Ron crept toward the source of the voice and discovered a deep crack in one of the stones, barely a few millimeters wide. The bars were wide enough to let the sound of the prisoner in the adjacent cell filter through. Ron waited patiently until he was sure the Dementors had departed. Then, he pulled his cot into the corner, leaned against the wall, and whispered through the narrow fissure, "Hey." There was no reply, just the sound of quiet sobbing. He gathered his courage and asked as loudly as he dared, "Can you hear me?" The crying paused abruptly. He could hear the soft patter of bare feet against the damp stone. Then came a ragged whisper, "Yes." "Who are you?" "My name's Ron." "And you?" A long pause followed. With his ear pressed against the stone, Ron thought he could hear the sound of a hand wiping a nose, followed by a soft thud as if she had leaned her head back against the wall. "Elaine," she finally whispered, "right." "Elaine, are you all?" Ron bit his tongue. Grimacing at the realization, of course, she wasn't all right. He had never been very good at offering reassurances. Silent, physical comfort was one thing, but when it came to discussing feelings. How many times had Hermione told him he was hopeless? That word echoed in his mind, mingling with the encroaching fog and dreariness. Clutching the warm metal of the deluminator, Ron said, "Look, I know it's awful, but you've got to hang on as best you can." Elaine sniffled. "And how am I supposed to do that?" "They let us out every day for an hour. I'll find you in the yard tomorrow." But when the next day arrived, there was no one new in the yard. Ron spent the hour with Dean, Ted, and Dirk as usual, sharing whispered memories. His companions seemed to be half awake from their stupor these days, too, bolstered by the daily touch of the deluminator. That night, after hastily finishing his meager dinner, Ron climbed back onto his cot and leaned close to the crack in the wall. "Hey," he whispered, "are you there?" He heard the familiar sound of feet on the grimy floor of the neighboring cell. Then Elaine replied softly, "I'm here." "Why weren't you? Are you coming to the yard today?" Ron asked. "I can't come out," Elaine replied. "Why not? It might help." "Help?" she echoed, her voice a hollow whisper. "No, it'll just make everything worse." Her words trailed off as fresh tears began to fall. Ron glanced toward the door, listening intently. The hall was silent. He clicked the deluminator, attempting to push the glowing ball of light through the crack in the wall, but it only hovered near the stone, unable to reach her cell. A soft, menacing rattle echoed from outside. He quickly extinguished the light and sank against the wall, a sense of gloom creeping back into the room. What was the point? Elaine choked out. What was the point of any of this? And now I'm as good as. Panic began to rise within Ron. "Please don't cry, just don't cry." There was no response, only the sound of her sobs. He realized no one was coming to help her, or him, for that matter. The deluminator pulsed in his hand. A small beacon of hope. "Tell me a happy memory," he whispered. Her sobs gradually quieted. A happy memory, yeah," he encouraged, holding the deluminator up to the crack in the wall. "Go on. Anything you like." A long pause followed before she finally rasped, "Once, on holiday with my family. We went to Greece, the 6 of us. There was one day when it rained, so everyone else stayed inside, and I got to go out by myself. No one cared. I sat by the seaside, and it was still sweltering, even though it was raining. I felt like I could do anything, just for myself." "You've got a big family," Ron said softly. "So do I, 5 older brothers and a little sister. I'm the second youngest." He paused, unsure why he was sharing this, but it felt necessary to fill the silence and keep her from breaking down again. He needed to remind himself of better times, or the weight of the present would crush him as well. "It's worse being the oldest," she whispered. "The moment you step into Hogwarts, you're old news." At the mention of school, Ron suddenly remembered Elaine, a year above them in Ravenclaw. "Have you finished Hogwarts?" he asked. "Yeah," she replied. "Were you any good at anything?" he inquired, immediately wondering if the question was insensitive. He could imagine Hermione thinking so. But Elaine only let out a faint, humorless laugh. I had friends, she said, which was all I really cared about. Or at least, I thought I had friends. A war reveals who your true friends are, I suppose. Ron sensed a hint of bitterness in her voice. Muggle-born, he thought, his heart sinking. Clearly, Elaine's friends hadn't deemed her worth the trouble. Anger flared within him. It's rubbish, he whispered fiercely. Absolute nonsense, all of it. That you're stuck here, and that you don't have better friends. I reckon now they can finally see what idiots they've been. She sniffled but responded quietly, how's that for a happy thought? This time, it was Ron who laughed, caught off guard by the unexpected humor. Ron loathed every stone in his cell with a deep passion. He loathed the arch above the narrow door, the flagstone floor with its gritty texture that stuck between his toes, and the tiny arrow slit through which he occasionally glimpsed a rare blue sky. The only thing he didn't loathe was the cracked stone that carried Elaine's voice. At first, they spoke every night, exchanging happy memories. Soon, their conversations spilled into the daylight hours as well. Ron discovered that simply hearing her voice kept the darkness at bay, almost as effectively as the Deluminator's ambient power. Elaine was mercurial, always hard to predict. At times, she seemed wounded or defensive, like a skittish animal. She despised discussing her parents so much that Ron quickly learned to avoid that topic. When she made clever remarks, there was never a hint of self-satisfaction in her tone, yet, her happiest moments were like fragile treasures he cherished. Most of her memories unfolded in isolation, and she longed to pursue something artistic, something with finesse. Elaine never spoke above a hoarse whisper, and when Ron pressed his ear to the stone wall, he often closed his eyes, trying to picture her. He thought about asking what she looked like but quickly dismissed the idea, reminding himself it was foolish. Despite this, he found himself nearly always initiating their conversations, which began to worry him. One afternoon, with his knees pulled tightly to his chest, he struggled to suppress the painful memory of his argument with Hermione after the Yule Ball in their 4th year. He hadn't understood what she wanted then, nor in their 6th year. What if Elaine, his one bright spot in this miserable cell, wished he would just leave her alone? Hermione had called him insensitive, and Fred and George always labeled him an idiot. A prat. What if his presence was just another form of torture for Elaine? Do you mind me talking to you so much? Ron managed to ask. No, she whispered back, then quickly added, as if embarrassed, I like it. All right, good. Ron let out a shaky laugh. I like talking to you too, even if you do fall asleep while I'm talking. That was once, she replied, and I slept better than usual that night. Ron hesitated for a moment. I could do it again, if you'd like. What? I could talk you to sleep. He felt his cheeks flush. Forget it. That was a stupid idea, yes, she interrupted. A brief silence followed. All right. Ron swallowed hard. What should I tell you? Your oldest brother, she whispered. The one who works for Gringotts. Tell me more about him, how you got along when you were younger. And so it continued. Each night, they took turns talking the other to sleep. When it was Elaine's turn, she would veto topic after topic until Ron finally chose one that seemed safe for her. She loved to describe places, the feeling of tropical air on her skin, the interiors of old buildings. But when it was Ron's turn to help her drift off to sleep, Elaine always asked him to share simple things, his childhood Quidditch experiences or his favorite foods, topics that often left him saying, oh, blimey, where do I start? Eventually, Ron realized he had never described the Deluminator to her. So, he did, and I can see your memories making it stronger, he said. When you tell me, well, all the things you've shared, I can see it growing brighter. If you'd just come to the yard, I could show it to you. It'd make you feel better. But Elaine didn't respond. Ron sighed and pulled away from the wall. She had started to do this, growing quiet whenever he tried to coax her out of her cell. He understood her need to limit contact with the Dementors, but he couldn't help wanting to connect with the person on the other side of the wall, the only comfort he had during the long nights when the Dementors passed outside their doors. Sometimes, when the patrols were frequent, they would whisper back and forth the only words they could manage, "I'm here." Although Elaine never appeared in the prison yard, Ron began to notice other new arrivals. The number of prisoners had slowly started to increase. "Why do you reckon there are so many?" he asked Dirk, Dean, and Ted. "One way to find out," Dirk replied, moving closer to one of the new arrivals, a small, balding man. What he told them hit Ron like a sack of bricks. Just 2 weeks prior, the Order of the Phoenix had attacked Malfoy Manor, where the entire ministry had been gathered. As a result, the ministry was raiding homes even more aggressively, leading to a surge in arrests. The ministry. Umbridge, Ron thought. Harry and Hermione must have been trying to steal her Horcrux during that Christmas event. Remembering their quest was jarring. Even more unsettling was the realization that he had been in Azkaban for over 2 months. Did they catch anyone? Ted whispered to. The balding man looked up. Did the Death Eaters catch any of the Order? He asked. The man nodded, his gaze drifting back with that familiar, bleary hopelessness. They're in maximum security, he murmured, top floor. He spoke the names softly, then faded away, leaving Ron and the others to stare at the stark, windowless walls that concealed Molly, Arthur, and Percy Weasley. That night, Ron huddled in front of the light, letting its strength and clarity wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt more like himself. More connected to the outside world. This light, it provided solace. Could it offer even more? He sensed the creeping chill of a patrol approaching. This time, however, he didn't extinguish the deluminator. He steeled himself, allowing the blanket to slip away. Light flooded his tiny cell, and the Dementor outside recoiled in confusion. It hesitated at the door, shuddered, and then fled down the hall. Quickly, Ron tucked the deluminator back into the torn mattress and lay down, feigning sleep just in time. He heard the rattling breaths of multiple Dementors as they came to investigate the disturbance. Please, he thought, as coldness wrapped around his heart and all plans faded from his mind. Please, let them go, let it go, make it stop. Eventually, the Dementors retreated, leaving him soaked in sweat. He fished the deluminator out from its hiding place and clutched it to his chest, gasping for breath. The Dementor had backed away from the light. The deluminator had been strong enough to scare one, possibly two. Could it be powerful enough to help his family and the Order break free? Dean, Ted, Dirk, and Elaine? Ron recalled how the light had intensified when he spoke to it with confidence. Gritting his teeth, he breathed out, I don't give up on people. That's another thing. He envisioned his mum and dad, just floors away, and Percy, who had apparently chosen to do the right thing. I won't give up on helping them. As the deluminator glowed warmly in his hand, Ron closed his eyes, piecing together a plan in his mind. This time, there could be no sacrifices. He needed a flawless strategy. He glanced down at the silver object, recognizing the winning move. Dementors were blind creatures, unable to see but deeply attuned to the shifting essence of human emotions. To the human guards, Ron's movements might have seemed suspicious as he navigated the prison yard in the days that followed, engaging with clusters of huddled prisoners, but the Dementors could not differentiate between acquaintances and strangers. They were oblivious to strategy or empathy. Their singular instinct was to feed, and Ron intended to exploit their ignorance. He coaxed memory after memory from the prisoners, listening to tales of weddings, births, and golden days spent with old friends. At first, the stories emerged in agonized strains, but soon they transformed into frantic confessions. Each whispered memory that flowed into the deluminator seemed to lift the spirits of the prisoners, stirring something deep within them that had long been dormant. Among the prisoners, they found a valuable ally, Augusta Longbottom. She had entered the prison with a commanding presence, as if Azkaban were a court and she was nobility. Though her body trembled, her eyes were sharp and unwavering. Having only been under the Dementor's influence for a few hours, she quickly identified gaps in their plan. There are 4 human guards on duty, she reminded them, directing her question to Ted and Dirk, who both turned to Ron. Ask Weasley, said Dirk. It's his operation. Augusta scrutinized Ron with a keen eye. Yes, my grandson has mentioned you. Prefect, isn't it, Gryffindor keeper? You fought alongside Neville at the Department of Mysteries. Ron found himself standing a little taller, the deluminator firmly in hand. Yeah, that's right. As for the guards, their wands might be useful. But as the plan developed in secrecy, Elaine was slipping away. Ron had shared every detail of their escape with her. Yet she still refused to step into the yard. During his brief hour of freedom, he had no opportunity to pull her out, as the Dementors guarded his door, ensuring he followed the hunched, shuffling crowd. In her isolation, Elaine was succumbing to the Dementors' grip. Ron could hear it in her voice. She could no longer speak him to sleep, struggling to summon any trace of life. Her happy memories were dwindling, growing weaker. Her voice had turned hollow, losing all inflection, and sometimes she would break into quiet, keening sobs halfway through a sentence. It seemed she was speaking not to Ron, but to someone in her mind. I'm sorry, she'd whisper repeatedly, nearly lost to despair. I'm sorry for everything, I thought it mattered. One night, he whispered her name through the crack in the wall, but she didn't respond. Elaine, he hissed, desperation creeping into his voice. Elaine. Are you there? It felt like he was plunging into an icy pool. Had she been eating? He realized he had forgotten to ask over the past few days. Surely, she couldn't be gone. Please be there, Ron moaned. Please be alive. Or else what? Came a faint whisper in reply. Ron's heart skipped a beat. He whispered back, or else I'll never get to meet you. He thought he heard the faintest sound, perhaps the beginning of a laugh. We're escaping soon, he pressed on, this week. I've gathered memories from everyone in the yard. I can't even look at the deluminator anymore. It's too painful. You have to be ready. Elaine didn't acknowledge his words. She neither agreed nor disagreed. Instead, she rasped, promise me something. Yeah. Remember the things I've said, would you? Don't talk like that. You just have to hold on for one more week. That's not what I mean, she whispered, but when he pressed her to explain, understanding, but she remained silent. Tonight, a whisper echoed through the prison yard. Tonight. Ron made his move an hour after dinner. He had learned that Dirk Cresswell's window slit overlooked the apparition point. And according to his intel, the night guard typically arrived after dinner each evening. He waited patiently, counting on the guard's routine, until he was confident that the shift had changed and they had 8 uninterrupted hours on the island. As a Dementor patrol approached his cell, he took a deep breath and clicked the deluminator. He hadn't dared to press its catch for weeks, and while he had anticipated a powerful display, nothing could have prepared him for the brilliant light that burst forth from its silver lip. The entire room was consumed by a blinding white glow, causing Ron to cry out and stumble back. He could hear a horse rattle at the far end of the hall. The Dementor had been repelled as if by the force of a Patronus. With urgency, he clicked the deluminator again, drawing the light back into its silver chamber. He quickly bundled himself into his cot, bracing for the guards to check on him as they had done before. From the corner of the cell, he heard Elaine's voice, a hoarse whisper. Ron, she called, almost as if testing the sound of his name. Yeah? He breathed back, a mixture of hope and fear in his chest. Good luck, she said. There was no time for a proper response. The Dementor's keys scraped against the lock of his door. Clunk. The door creaked open wide. Ron sprang to his feet, holding the deluminator forward, and unleashed the light. The force of the glow sent the 3 Dementors reeling back. Like grains of sand swept away by a powerful wave, with the light guiding him, Ron sprinted after them, down the hall, surrounded by a radiant glow. The intensity of the deluminator illuminated the damp stones, making them sparkle painfully. Its power surged through Ron, filling him with every memory and confident assurance he had ever possessed, a certainty he had never felt before. But there was no time to savor this newfound strength. The Dementors who had unlocked his cell would soon be searching for their prey. Ron raced down the hall, retracing his steps toward the yard, and sprinted down one of the endless spiral staircases leading to the ground floor. Just near the prison entrance was a chamber where guards forced prisoners to change into their uniforms. Augusta Longbottom had mentioned that within that room were a set of steps. They must lead to the guards' quarters, she'd said, where they can escape the effects of the Dementors. That was the chamber Ron needed to find. With the deluminator extended in front of him, he dashed through the first floor. The dazzling light spilled into the cells, rousing the sleeping prisoners with cries of surprise. Ahead, Dementors were fleeing down side corridors, swirling and billowing like shadows cast by a strobe light. Ron burst into a wide hall. At the opposite end stood a door, its window revealing a rain-lashed night. He sprinted down the corridor, pushed through the door into the search chamber, and spotted the steps Augusta had described. He barreled down them and burst into the guards' quarters, where 4 voices cried out in alarm. In that moment, he took in the scene, a cozy lounge with a flickering fire in the hearth and an exploding snap deck spread across a long table. 2 patron users patrolled the perimeter, shielding the guards from the misery above. Ron realized the light from the deluminator must be even more blinding to the guards than it was to him. They were doubled over, casting spells that ricocheted off the walls. He threw himself forward, narrowly avoiding a jet of light from the nearest guard, and wrested another's wand from her hand. Stupefy! He shouted, dropping a third guard in his tracks. The fourth had fallen to his knees, moaning and weeping, arms folded over his eyes. With adrenaline surging, Ron sprinted forward, snatching the wands from the third and fourth guards while dodging any further attacks from the first. But when he wheeled around to stun the first guard, the man had vanished. Ron swore loudly and flung himself up the steps after him. The guard couldn't be allowed to escape. He couldn't be permitted to raise the alarm, but by the time Ron reached the main hall, the prison's front door was swinging wide open. The guard was sprinting across the rocky terrain toward the apparition point. Ron slid down the rain-slicked steps of the prison, aiming at the man's back. Stupefy! He shouted, the deluminator casting a brilliant light through the downpour like an enormous flood lamp. Impedimenta. Stupefy! But the guard reached the apparition point, the only spot on the island where anyone could enter or exit, and just like that, he vanished. Frustration surged through Ron, and words that would have horrified his mother spilled from his lips. They had planned to have all night to do this, with the guards sealed away and the Dementors held at bay, an entire night to free everyone in this wretched place. But that guard would make it to the ministry and raise the alarm. Ron was certain he had only 15, maybe 20 minutes. He dashed back toward the stairwell. Dirk's cell was the closest, followed by Ted's and then Dean's. Ron handed each of them a wand, and as the corridors of Azkaban echoed with confused shouts, they raced toward the 17th floor, the deluminator scattering bands of Dementors in their wake. Dirk performed a clever bit of charm work that made the stairs spin, propelling them faster toward their destination, the maximum security hall. Open them! Ron shouted, all of them. Alohomora! Dirk, Ted, and Dean shouted in unison, and one by one, the cell doors burst wide open. Ron hurried forward, peering into each cell, searching, hoping, and there they were. His parents, frighteningly thin and staggering out of their cells. Their faces streaked with tears. Ron, they gasped together, and then they were throwing themselves at him in a tight embrace, nearly knocking him off his feet. Ron squeezed his eyes shut, allowing himself a brief moment to hold them before pulling back. Where's Percy? He asked, urgency creeping into his voice. Panted heavily as he turned around, only to find Percy standing there, his glasses cracked over one eye. How? Percy stammered. How? Never mind how, Ron replied urgently. We need to get to the apparition point. We've only got a few wands, and... He pivoted back, taking in the scene around him. The hallway was crowded with people, Augusta Longbottom, Oliver Wood, and Angelina Johnson, Sturgis Podmore, and to Ron's astonishment, Nymphadora Tonks, heavily pregnant and weeping into her father's shoulder. The thought of the other prisoners gnawed at him. Elaine, he realized. There was no time to go back for her, she would die here. Just then, a distant sound made his heart drop. It was the unmistakable crack of apparition. Everyone rushed to the windows and peered through the narrow slits. Ron could see wandlight flickering at the tip of the island. More cracks echoed through the storm, and the number of lights multiplied. The ministry is here, Ted breathed, gripping his daughter's shoulders tightly. It looks like they're holding at the apparition point for now, Tonks said, probably waiting for us to make a break for it. But they won't stay there forever. Weasley, what do we do? Dirk called out, his wand gripped tightly like a knife. The fierce determination on his face told Ron he was prepared to fight to the death. Ron glanced around and saw everyone looking to him, waiting for direction. A nervous shiver ran through him, but then the deluminator pulsed in his hand. You can do this, he reminded himself. We can't fight them with just 3 wands, Ron said. We need something else. A different way to. He turned back to the slit in the wall and heard panicked shouts coming from the apparition point. The ministry was attempting to conjure patron uses, but swarms of dementors, seemingly enraged by the deluminator, were beginning to swoop down on them, attacking their own masters. Yes, Ron whispered, their best weapon was the very force that had been sent to imprison them. We need to get everyone into the yard. He shouted. Dirk, Ted, Dean, patron uses. Without hesitation, they sprang into action. 3 silver animals erupted into the air, gleaming brilliantly against the daylight cast by the deluminator. Dirk, Ron instructed, make your way to the front entrance and block it as best you can. Ted, take everyone here down to the yard, stay close to your Patronus. It won't be able to fend off this many dementors for long. Dirk, once you've secured the front door, join us in the yard. Dean, you and I will start letting people out floor by floor. Let's move. The prison loomed like an immense fortress, but over the past weeks, Ron, Dean, Ted, and Dirk had made a rough estimate of how many prisoners were held within. Just before their hour in the yard began, a low gong echoed through the halls. It sounded 4 times a day, which Dirk reasoned indicated 4 different groups that came to the yard. Their own group had around 150 prisoners, so they figured there should be about 600 in total. This assumption seemed accurate. On each of Azkaban's 17 floors, Ron and Dean discovered a few dozen prisoners scattered among the hundreds of cells. Dean cast mass Allohammers with a swift motion of his wand, while Ron called out to the prisoners staggering out of their cells to stay within the light of the deluminator. Always, at the edge of that light, he could see the Dementors seething and writhing, desperately trying to break through to their quarry. But the numbers of Dementors were starting to dwindle. When Ron glanced through the narrow windows into the torrential rain, he saw more and more furious Dementors fleeing the prison, drawn to the arriving ministry members, whom they seemed to perceive as easier prey. By the time Ron and Dean had shuttled half the prisoners into the yard, an all-out battle raged on the edge of the island. They needed every moment they could get. The prisoners were so frail that they hobbled along at an agonizing pace. Dean had an idea to transfigure a quicker route down to the yard. What if we turned the walls into slides? He suggested, however. When he attempted to cast spells on the walls, they flickered and extinguished immediately. The fortress had been reinforced against all magical attacks. The greatest danger was the growing number of prisoners in the yard, their fear and anticipation creating a beacon for the Dementors. Ron often had to rush to the narrow slit windows during the evacuation, shining the deluminator out into the yard to bolster Ted's and Dirk's patron uses, driving the Dementors upward and out of the area. Soon, they were approaching Ron's sector of the prison, and his throat began to tighten with anxiety. Would Elaine refuse to come with them? Surely the power of the deluminator would awaken her, just as it had for the other prisoners. Yet, she had seemed on death's door all week. Ron rounded the corner and entered his hall. Alohomora! Dean shouted, and the doors swung wide open. People began to pour out, dozens of them, but Ron's gaze was fixed on Elaine's cell door halfway down the corridor. No one emerged. Hold this for a moment, Ron said, pressing the deluminator into Dean's hand. Dean nodded, calling out to the prisoners while Ron darted through the crowd and reached the threshold of Elaine's cell. Elaine, he panted. Come on, it's time, we've got to go. She was trembling, her blanket wrapped tightly around her. Elaine. Ron urged, stepping closer. You can't, finally. She lowered her blanket, and Ron halted in his tracks. He had imagined Elaine hundreds of times by now, reasoning with himself that she might not be as lovely as he had pictured. It felt shallow to think that way, and he had heard both Ginny's and Hermione's disgusted voices in his mind when he entertained such thoughts. But he couldn't help it, his imagination had run wild, yet, Elaine's looks weren't the issue. The real problem was that she wasn't Elaine, she was someone entirely different, Pansy Parkinson. Ron took an involuntary step back, his mouth agape. "I told you," Pansy rasped. Her face was gaunt, and her once lustrous dark hair now hung limp and tangled. The voice he remembered as a derisive shriek had transformed into a hoarse whisper. And her tattered prison clothing made it hard for him to imagine her in the expensive robes from Twilfit and Tattings that she had flaunted during every school break. It was Pansy Parkinson who had once spoken him to sleep, Pansy Parkinson who had eased the darkness, and Pansy, who felt the least loved of her family. She had even begun to whisper apologies to him over the past week. "I told you," she said again, "it would have been worse to go out there with all those people, your people." "Didn't I tell you, Weasley?" "Don't call me that," Ron replied, the words slipping out before he could stop them. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, lost in the moment. Then, from behind him, Dean burst in. "Ron." He skidded down the hall. "This floor's done, we've got to get to the next." As the Deluminator's light illuminated Pansy, making her shudder, Dean's voice faltered. "Pansy?" he asked, surprise evident in his tone. Ron shook himself back to reality. What was he doing, standing there when they still had 4 more floors to evacuate? "This way, we've got to get you out." "This way," he urged, but Pansy remained frozen, staring at him as if she didn't understand. Finally, Ron lunged forward, his hand wrapping around her wrist. "Come on," he said. Her face was smeared with grime and sweat, her eyes shimmering with emotion. She nodded, just as Ron and Dean were about to evacuate the ground floor. He heard it, a boom, followed by a thud. The Ministry had reached the prison doors. They were trying to break in. "Come on," he shouted, urgency flooding his voice. Dean called out as Ron sprinted forward, urging the last few prisoners out of their cells. At last, the final group reached the prison yard. The rain had ceased, and stars twinkled in the night sky above. "That's everyone," Ron shouted to the Order, who were gathered nearby. In an instant, Ted and Dirk raised their wands, transfiguring the gravel of the yard into sturdy stone barricades that sealed off the 5 doors. The frightened prisoners, now gathered in the yard, turned in unison toward the deluminator that Ron held high. Its light casting a warm glow over them, he watched as fear morphed into defiance, and pain transformed into hope. For a brief moment, he caught sight of Pansy in the crowd, her posture shifting into that of a dancer, a stance he had always thought was snobby back at school. Suddenly, cries erupted throughout the prison yard. Hands shot up into the night. Ron's gaze turned upward. The Ministry had breached the entrance, and the Dementors were returning in full force. On the prison's battlements, bursts of wand light illuminated the scene as Ministry wizards looked down into the courtyard, pointing and shouting, directing the Dementors toward them. Screams of terror echoed from the other prisoners. And dread washed over Ron as a dark shadow enveloped the courtyard, blocking out the starlight. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the flash of a camera. How long had this siege lasted? Surely over an hour. How widely had the news spread? Once the Death Eaters realized it was a full-scale revolt, they would come themselves. With determination, Ron thrust the deluminator upward, and the light burst forth, scattering the Dementors high into the air. Once again, the Dementors turned their attention to the Ministry wizards on the battlements, and screams filled the air alongside distant flashes of light. Ron could see dozens of patron uses darting around the battlements. Cries also emanated from within the prison. And Ron knew the horror the Ministry faced as they navigated the maze of corridors. The Order turned. Ron felt the tight grip of his mother's hand on his arm, a painful reminder of their precarious situation. "What's our plan, Weasley?" Dirk asked, urgency lacing his voice. "How are we going to reach that apparition point?" Tonks chimed in, still catching her breath. "We're not," Ron replied firmly. "There are too many of us, but it makes sense, doesn't it? If we can just undo the apparition wards, we can all apparate out to Order headquarters using these wands. Undo the apparition wards? Percy spluttered in disbelief, but wait a moment. That kind of magic requires an arithmancer to perform extensive diagnostic charm work. Dirk Cresswell gestured broadly at the prison yard, filled with people. Then it's a good thing we've got 600 people to choose from, isn't it? He turned back to Ron. Weasley, should I use Sonorous to get their attention? No, Ron said, glancing up at the battlements. Someone might hear and figure out what we're planning. He scanned the crowd, then addressed the Order. Everyone except Dean, Dirk, and the Tonkses, go through the crowd and find an arithmancer who knows what they're doing. As the Order dispersed, Ron turned to Dean. Mate, he said apologetically, can you give your wand to Tonks? Tonks, Dirk, Ted, we need some cover from above in case the Ministry starts firing spells down on us. I think this thing, he pointed to the umbrella of light that hovered over the courtyard, could fend off minor hexes, but we'll need more protection. Can you conjure a decent shield for us? The night deepened around them, and the impenetrability of Azkaban became all too clear. As Ron had predicted, the perfect prison was also an ideal site for a siege. Though they could hear blasts echoing within the fortress's sheer walls, nothing broke through. The Ministry made sporadic attempts to rain spells down upon them, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the Dementors hovering ominously above the battlements. They hurried for cover as the diagnostic charm faded, just as Percy had promised. In a corner of the yard, an arithmancer named Suresh Mudun paced nervously, muttering spells while twisting one of his wands in intricate patterns that Ron couldn't connect to Hermione's homework from Professor Vector. Meanwhile, the prisoners huddled against the wall, tense and fearful, occasionally shouting warnings whenever Ministry wizards appeared in groups on the battlements. Ron moved through the yard, holding the deluminator high to cast its light evenly across the crowd. He spoke to familiar faces, offering reassuring words drawn from his hours spent in the yard. He was taken aback by the way they looked at him, not just with admiration, but with faith, as if they believed he was someone capable of standing strong and achieving something significant on his own. And perhaps he was, he thought, but not entirely alone. He caught sight of Pansy, leaning against a wall, far from where he had last seen her, as if she had intentionally distanced herself. A lump rose in his throat when their eyes met. Conflicting emotions surged within him, leaving him uncertain, so he quickly moved on, keeping his focus on the imminent dangers. Ron had lost track of how long the siege had lasted, an hour, maybe more, when a noise made his stomach drop. Shouting erupted from behind one of the 5 entrances to the yard. Ted's and Dirk's reinforcements had concealed the doors, but their transfigured barricades wouldn't hold like the formidable foundations of Azkaban. Most of the prisoners recoiled from the door, while Ron and the rest of the Order surged forward. Sturgis and Ted, who had taken over shielding duties, stood at the front with their wands raised. Suresh isn't done yet, Percy hissed, bobbing anxiously at Ron's side. He needs a few more minutes, Ron said, and then we'll know how deep the rune anchor is buried. After that, we need to find it before we can destroy it. He swallowed hard. We'll just have to hope there aren't many Aurors behind that door. If we can hold them off, it's our only chance. They steeled themselves as the shouts grew louder. Ron's fists clenched. Was there really a chance? The doorway was narrow, just wide enough for one person at a time. Which meant Sturgis and Ted would have the advantage. If only they could keep the Ministry from pouring into the courtyard. Reducto. A voice shouted from inside, and the stone reinforcement shattered into a cloud of dust. As Sturgis and Ted began to hurl hexes, Molly Weasley cried out, "Stop!" and threw herself in front of them. Molly. Sturgis bellowed, "Get out of the..." But Ron understood why his mother had rushed forward. He, too, recognized the voice that had cast the Reductor curse. The first thing to surge over the threshold, through the swirling smoke and debris, was a menagerie of silver animals, a galloping horse, 2 fluttering birds, and a massive, prowling lynx. A tabby cat followed closely behind a wolf, then an otter, and a majestic stag. Then, amidst the chaos, the freckled faces of Fred and George Weasley emerged. and the rest of the Order of the Phoenix burst into the inner yard of Azkaban, gasping, sweating, bruised, and bloodied, their wands raised high.